You can find virtually any shape, size, or species of wood here. The lumberyard. It's a vast, busy, and noisy complex where technology is brought to bear on stacks and stacks of lumber that will eventually form the structures we live in.
One of the things we're relearning today is that wood has a unique appeal to us as individuals. We want to be surrounded by wood to build our homes and to beautify our homes. And that's where the lumberyard is the last mile for delivering that source and those values to both homeowners and builders.
I got a guy calling in on that. Want to check that out?
In Richmond, California, Channel Lumber is a traditional lumberyard that sells primarily to the construction industry.
Over the last 50 years, we started with industry, moved to the local contractors, and then moved to the elite contractors that actually build America. People that build skyscrapers in San Francisco. And at one time, we had 5 bridges going here. We were delivering to all the 5 bridges and the highways. People don't realize, but they use a lot of timbers for supporting the concrete.
It all starts here, in stands which have taken decades or even centuries to mature. Logs are cut into coarse planks at the sawmill and delivered in rough form to the lumberyard. 12 by 12 Douglas fir timber forms the foundation of the West Coast lumber industry. It can be modified at the lumberyard into a vast variety of wood products. A resaw is used to change the size of the wood to specific dimensions.
Behind me is our largest resaw at this facility. Its main function is to resaw rough timber that came from the sawmill. That's why we call it a resaw. We'll be running this. We're going to bust it down the middle, okay? We're about to start up our 60-inch resaw. It has 2 60-inch wheels across. One's down below in the pit where you can't see it. The one up above you can see. This carries an 8-inch wide blade, 30 feet long. We're going to be center splitting 12 by 12 Douglas fir into 2 equal pieces of 6 by 12.
The timbers move on rollers that bring them up to the operator, who then feeds them into the 125 horsepower resaw. Attached to the machine's 2 wheels is a bandsaw blade. As it's pulled by the wheels, the blade's razor-sharp teeth cut the wood passing through. This resaw is capable of cutting 300 board feet per minute. Just across the way is a planer, which takes the resawn wood to the next level.
What this machine does is takes rough lumber, surfs it to a desired thickness and width. It can surface up to an 8 by 16 dimension, which is very large, down to a 2 by 4, let's say. It's capable of running at speeds of 400 feet per minute.
Unlike the resaw, the planer feeds the wood automatically. And instead of a bandsaw blade, it has 4 heads, each with 8 rotating knives that do the cutting. The wood hits the top and bottom heads in sequence. They're running at 100 horsepower.
Now it hits opposing side heads, which are 50 to 35 horsepower apiece. That gives you your final width. Self-feeds out, gets transferred on some transfer chains off to an automatic stacking machine. One man runs this whole operation. Okay, looks good. We started out with rough Douglas fir, 4 by 8. We've surfaced down to 3.5 by 7.5. It's now nice finish. It's ready to go to the contractor for building purposes.
Our 2 by 4 on order, and then we've got...
This lumberyard stocks around 5 million board feet of lumber on its 14 acres. 1 board foot is equal to a piece of wood that's 1 foot square and 1 inch thick. Since this yard mainly supplies very large jobs, you won't find the finer interior woods here, like mahogany or maple, which are used for furniture, cabinetry, and flooring. This yard is all about construction, In addition to Douglas fir, Channel stocks a few other species that have specialized uses, like redwood, which grows primarily in California but also in southern Oregon.
Redwood is mainly used for decking, exterior applications, build a trellis, an arbor, anything outside. Redwood holds up very well to the weather. Also, insects won't attack it, and it won't rot. And cedar basically has the same principles. It's a beautiful product to work with.
Channel also creates moldings and shaped wood for a variety of purposes, as specified by the client. For this specialized work, they first have to create a pattern.
As you can see, this machine has a grinding wheel which must be dressed exactly to the same thickness as your tracing pin. So we have our template, we have our cutter head, we have our grinding wheel.
Using the template, the knife is then ground, following the pattern, just like making a key at the hardware store. This results in a perfect profile knife.
Let's take a look at our molder. Here we have a knife that's been ground. Over here is our customer's profile that we are going to reproduce. It's known as a tongue and groove, used primarily for roofing. So let's see it run.
The finished product will be delivered to the roofing contractor who ordered it. This machine, and in fact all the wood processing activities at the lumberyard, kick up a lot of dust and shavings. To deal with this, every lumberyard must have a blower system. High-efficiency fans, called cyclones, suck shavings and dust through tubes attached to every machine in the plant. Once the debris is captured, it's dropped down into a closed system on a truck for disposal.
From here, it'll go what's sold as horse bedding, cogen fuel, and or particle board plants will buy our product.
Impressive recycling. But for some lumberyards that buy and sell salvaged or reclaimed wood, recycling is not a byproduct, it's the central activity. In a sleepy little corner of Maine, longleaf lumber specializes in wood that's typically at least 100 years old. Or in the case of antique heart pine, is virtually extinct because of overharvesting.
Our antique heart pine, which is the soul of our business, comes from mill buildings that were built during the Industrial Revolution. They were built with heart pine sawn in the south and shipped up to the north. We also get a lot of material from barns and houses.
The reclaimed wood business began in the 1960s, with roots in the anti-establishment and environmental movements. Supporters took pride in the fact that they weren't cutting down trees to build or renovate their houses.
And as those hippies have grown older and become retiring CEOs of corporations with 5,000 square foot mansions, they've bought into this whole market of recycled lumber. It ties them back to the earth and to something that's very personal.
While the market for reclaimed wood has certainly grown, it's less than 1% of the total lumber industry. Still, that's big business. About 60 companies nationwide are in the reclaimed lumber trade, recycling around 250 million board feet annually. These lumberyards typically mill and resell lumber at about 4 times its original cost. Prices of $16 to $20 a board foot are not unusual. In Longleaf's lumberyard, a recent shipment of heavily distressed wood has risen from history and now awaits millwork.
These are white oak pilings that came out of Boston Harbor, Battery Wharf in Boston Harbor. We believe that they're about 100 years old, but we're not certain. Some of them are very distressed, as you can see. Others are very solid, but we'll saw these up and make flooring out of these. A lot of them have a lot of very, very deep color, especially staining from iron that's been in these things for many years. It's reacted with the salt water, and a black-blue kind of stain shoots through the grain and colors it in a very unusual way, and some people really, really like it.
But typically, the reclaimed wood comes from buildings.
Our material comes in beam form off a demolition site or a dismantling site, and as you can see behind you, it's stacked up in an orderly fashion so that we can determine what we can yield out of the material. We pull all the metal out of it. We're using airport wand type metal detectors, personal type metal detectors. And then we saw the material into boards with a band mill. And we dry the material. Even though it's quite old and relatively dry, it still isn't necessarily dry enough for millwork, which is what we do.
Reclaimed wood is dried in a kiln that has high-speed blowers, sending in heated air for 3 to 4 days.
And then we run it through a 4-side molder, at which point it is a finished product.
Longleaf's lumberyard and mill are in Maine, but its showroom is here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where the demand for reclaimed wood is great.
We wanted customers to be able to come in and walk on the different floors that we have available. When you see a larger expanse of these installed floors, they get a real sense of what they can have in their homes. People aesthetically relate to this. It's incredibly beautiful, tight-grained, warm tones and colors that you just don't find in new wood. This is an example of our select grade heart pine. In this grade, you will have knots, nail holes, and some mineral staining. Over here, we have our clear heart pine. Customers, if they're looking for a more formal look, they'll say, I'd like the material without knots, nail holes, mineral staining. Chestnut is one of the most valued floors that we have. The chestnut tree at one time made up 25% of the forests on the eastern seaboard. After a blight hit it in the early 1900s, the trees were decimated. The only way to have a chestnut floor or millwork is through the salvage process.
In many instances, the rougher, more distressed the condition of the wood, the better.
We surfaced one side, but left the live edge on the outer edge. Customers love to have this as a countertop or bar top or a mantle. It shows the original shape of the tree. This is what they call virgin growth lumber.
Virgin growth lumber comes from trees that were here when European settlers first came to America. Shortly after the Pilgrims landed, they would use that virgin lumber to establish America's earliest lumber yards. Here in Boston Harbor, nearly 400 years ago, shortly after the Pilgrims landed in America, lumber yards began springing up along the shoreline. They provided shipbuilders and homesteaders with the wood they needed. Settlers were especially interested in New England's vast stands of white pine, readily available to meet the demands of a new society. By the mid-1600s, the Massachusetts Bay colonists had moved into the countryside, establishing the New England town of Amherst. It's here that the Coles family founded a commercial lumber yard in 1741.
These were English Puritans who had come to the Boston area with the 1630 migration from England. They were into dairy farming, crop farming. They were also, if they had woods, were selling the lumber. Records show that the Coleses very early were selling lumber to other people in the town.
Wood cutting technology was primitive. The Coles surely used a pit saw.
One man is actually in a hole in the ground. The log is suspended on a sawhorse sort of thing on top, and there's another man that stands up above the log, and they push and pull on the same saw and cut it that way.
They also used a two-handled saw, as demonstrated by Paul Jones and his daughter Cinda, who represent the 8th and 9th generations in the family business. The first lumber yards in the Massachusetts colony were rudimentary.
The earliest lumber yard here would have been probably part of the cow barn even, or a shed off the cow barn with just stacks of lumber in it that he had accumulated, perhaps some logs or fence posts or whatever it is he was selling.
Since green or freshly cut wood is subject to warping, colonists cured the wood by exposing it to the sun for a year or two. Lumberyards usually profited as towns grew, and Coles was no exception. The yard provided wood for the town's expansion. It supplied wood for Amherst College, the University of Massachusetts, and Emily Dickinson's family. When America's railways were constructed in the 19th century, builders turned to lumberyards for enormous supplies of railroad ties. Coles profited handsomely during this period. The forests that the Coles family owns still provide wood to the mill and to the lumberyard, which continues to flourish.
We have hardwoods and softwoods. Softwoods would be pine and hemlock. Hardwoods would be the oaks and the birches and the maples. We primarily saw pine, oak, and hemlock here at the sawmill and sell our other logs to other mills and other users.
This lumberyard has evolved and expanded like many lumberyards, now selling hardware and other building necessities.
9 generations ago, my ancestor Jonathan Coles could never have envisioned the enterprise this has grown to, encompassing 16 acres, almost 50 employees now, a business that you can build a house with, containing lumber, plywood, paint, kitchen cabinets, anything else you'd want to build your dream home.
The Coles Lumberyard isn't just a part of a family tradition. It's the continuation of a human enterprise that dates back thousands of years. Wherever a coastal seafaring civilization took root, there was a lumberyard. All ships were made of wood, and someone had to provide the lumber. One of the first recorded lumberyard transactions dates back to 1200 BC. A Phoenician prince had a well-stocked yard on the Mediterranean shore, in what is now Lebanon.
These were the famous cedars of Lebanon, huge trees that were equivalent to anything you would find in the Pacific Northwest. And these trees went to build the ships of Egypt, the ships of Phoenicia, and the ships of Israel. Any power in that part of the world required a Phoenicia for their ships.
And because dominance at sea contributed to a kingdom's strength and security, whoever ran a lumberyard wielded power as well. Around 1000 BC, a large quantity of lumber was brokered in connection with one of the most famous temples in history.
A Phoenician prince named Cyrus, who had a lumberyard on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. And from there, he provided King Solomon with gigantic quantities of cedar that was used to frame the temple built in Jerusalem.
The lumber trade expanded exponentially in 12th and 13th century Europe, especially in Germany, England, and Italy, when cities began to grow.
Unlike in ancient times, when they built these cities with brick and mortar or with stone, these new city-states were built with large quantities of lumber.
Lumberyards appeared in major port cities because that's where the shipyards were. The Venice Arsenal, a naval depot, held what was perhaps Europe's biggest lumberyard.
The arsenal was heavily guarded because if they lost their timber supply, they lost their power.
When Europeans came to the American Northeast, their first major industries were shipbuilding and sawmills, which provided the necessary pine lumber.
In some cases, the sawmills had lumberyards adjacent to them, but they also ended up setting up separate lumberyards because of the popularity and the need for lumber.
American America's westward expansion brought further growth to the lumber trade. First, the settlers built their homes by cutting trees themselves.
As these initial settled areas were cut over and as towns began to develop, then there was a need for shipping in lumber from more distant points, and then there was a demand for a central type of location where lumber could be purchased by local homeowners and contractors and businesses.
When the railroad arrived in 1861, Chicago benefited from its central location as well as its proximity via the Chicago River to the lumber stands of the Great Lakes region. It became the lumberyard capital of the Midwest with an extensive lumber district.
The railroad had a big impact on the spread of lumber yards because every town that was a stop on the railroad would have a yard because the lumber would be shipped in, would sit in that yard, and then be distributed out to the residents of the little towns as they built up.
The mid-19th century saw a major technological change in the lumberyard. The bandsaw helped lumberyards expand from being mere warehouses to businesses that could cut wood to order. Around that same time, the gold rush lured people to the West Coast and San Francisco.
There was a tremendous explosion in the growth of the city, homes needing to be built and businesses and so on. And shipbuilding was one of the first industries that was taken on when gold was discovered. So lumberyards became an intrinsic part of the skyline of early San Francisco.
Lumber came from California, the Pacific Northwest, and even as far away as New England. The Northeast also supplied many lumberyard entrepreneurs, men with lumber backgrounds who'd come west to seize a new opportunity.
These folks quickly realized that there was a limited amount of money that could be made in the gold fields, but there was almost an unlimited amount that could be made in the lumber industry.
As a result, the San Francisco Bay Area became the lumberyard capital of the West. Lumber dealers flourished with San Francisco's boom and tragedies. Remarkably, from 1849 to 1851, San Francisco suffered 6 devastating fires. Then in 1906, it was struck by a massive earthquake and subsequent fire. The Bay Area's busy lumberyards slowed down during wartime and the Depression. But after World War II, lumber was again in great demand in San Francisco and across America. Returning GIs could easily qualify for home loans, and the construction business grew spectacularly. Today, with a nationwide building boom, lumber yards continue to flourish. But in addition to traditional lumber, the yards now provide products that have revolutionized the construction industry: engineered woods. In the construction industry, builders have always looked for ways to do things faster and cheaper, while still maintaining quality. So, for much of the 20th century, they went to the lumberyard to purchase plywood, large, sturdy sheets of engineered wood. It's used for framing, roofing, and flooring. Plywood eliminates the need for hammering together many smaller pieces of wood, which is the way homes were constructed before plywood came along.
So we're able to develop a stronger, lighter, easier to install, faster to install home than that is typically possible with solid sawn lumber.
Plywood actually dates back to the Egyptians. The oldest example of plywood was found inside a 3rd Dynasty coffin, made of 6 layers of wood, each 4 millimeters thick and held together by wooden pegs. Plywood was first patented in New York City in 1865, but it was perfected in the early 20th century, with better glues bonding the sheets under heat. Plywood's big advantages include its standard size of 4 feet by 8 feet, its low cost, and its strength and stability. To make plywood, a log is softened with steam and then mounted on a lathe. A long, sharp knife peels off a thin layer of wood, which is called a veneer. Sections called plies are cut and then set aside to dry. The next step is the gluing of the plies together using synthetic plastics such as urea resins or phenylformaldehyde. Several sheets of veneer are layered together with the grain direction alternating between the different layers.
And what happens there is that you actually have the strength enhanced by this cross pattern of the grain.
Otherwise, a single sheet of wood this thin might crack along a weak spot in the grain. The stack is then heated to around 250 degrees Fahrenheit and squeezed under great pressure by hydraulic presses to form a rigid panel. The glue dries in minutes. Finally, the plywood panels are trimmed and sanded. They're now ready for shipment to the lumberyard. But in recent years, plywood's position as the most popular engineered wood of the construction industry has been overtaken by another product.
The traditional veneer plywood that most of us are familiar with has recently been passed by oriented strand board, or what looks like flakes of material, which use smaller diameter species and faster growing species, and yet have the same strength and durability properties as veneer plywood.
Drive by any construction project, and chances are you'll see oriented strand board, or OSB. It contains layers of flaked wood in specific crisscrossed orientations that are as strong as plywood. OSB's chief advantage over plywood is that it's cheaper.
What they're doing is taking wood that ordinarily, or let's say in the old days, may have just gone out in a pile out back because they didn't know what to do with it.
The process begins with logs being fed into a machine that shreds them into wafer-thin strands up to 6 inches long and 1 inch wide. After the strands have been mixed with wax and resin binders for eventual bonding, they're sifted and arranged into approximately parallel lines. Next, the loosely adhering material is cut into mats. The mats are then stacked so that the strands of each one, like plywood, are at opposing angles to each other. This creates OSB's strength. The outer layers of the stack contain randomly oriented mats. When the stack is subjected to intense heat and pressure, the bonding resins are activated, and a master panel is formed. In the final step, these panels are cut to size, typically 4 by 8. Besides oriented strand board and plywood, there are other engineered wood products that combine wood with high-strength adhesives. Glue lamp is one such product.
You can't buy a single piece of wood 100 feet long.
To get beams of unusually long lengths for large construction projects, smaller pieces of wood are glued together in the glue lamp process. The first step, wood is kiln dried at the factory and then planed to smoothness and the correct dimensions.
Then it goes to the finger joint line, where we apply a structural finger joint to each end of the laminations, and a structural glue is applied to the finger joint. And then those pieces now run in line to a mating line, which then travels through a radial frequency tunnel. The RF radial frequency tunnel is like a microwave oven. It accelerates the cure bonding of the finger joint glue.
The laminated sections are now cut to required length for the beam that's being manufactured. Glue is then applied to the wide face of the laminates.
The laminations run down to the glue press, where they are set and then are pressed together with these glue blocks to create the structural bonding that's necessary for the glue laminated beam.
Next, a worker pounds the glue lamps to align them before the glue sets.
picked up by the overhead.
Another worker uses a pneumatic gun to screw in rods that will hold the glued laminations together with great pressure. Drying takes 6 to 8 hours.
The planer now is going to plane both sides at the same time into a final net dimension.
In the finish room, the various glue lams are sanded and cleaned up. Glue lams are crafted into many different forms.
One is a glue laminated beam truss. You can see the connector plates, and these are factory assembled and delivered to the job site, ready to install.
As useful as these man-made products are, they rarely turn up at lumber yards dealing in exotic and specialty woods. There, it's the exquisite handiwork of nature that rules. Of all species of woods, none seem to fuel the imaginations of homeowners and designers like exotic woods. These are rare species with unique hues and grain patterns, which don't occur in domestic woods. They come from places like South America, Africa, and Asia, and are sold in specialty lumber yards.
We're exposed to many more cultures and experiences than people were 50 or 100 years ago. And the appeal of exotic wood is it allows a much wider range of beauty to come into people's homes.
Whether it's wood for cabinetry, a musical instrument, a yacht interior, or even $1 million bar in a 5-star hotel, want wins out over need when it comes to exotic woods. For centuries, only royals could afford such beauty and luxury. But when the Industrial Revolution created a middle class, it also created consumers of imported woods, like mahogany and teak. Today, like the royalty of a bygone era, the upper middle classes also want to surround themselves with beauty. And one of the ways they do so is with exotic woods.
They've got the money to pay for a premium or unique or exotic material that has a unique appeal or look.
From South America come well-known species like rosewood and mahogany. Even more exotic are bloodwood, purple heart, and cocobolo. From Asia, there's camphor wood and ebony macassar. From Africa come the beautiful colors and grains of zebra wood and bacote. 20 years ago, in the Puget Sound village of Portsmouth, Washington, 2 partners from the village's wooden boat building community saw a need and filled it with a company called Eden Saw Wood.
We realized that there was a larger market probably for the wood than our skills as shipwrights. And so we started Eden Saw on that basis.
Today, Eden Saw is a multi-million-dollar business. Its Portsmouth facility is situated on 7 acres and is continually expanding. It offers over 60 species of fine and exotic wood.
We've supplied wood for Bill Gates' house, for some of Paul Allen's residences. We've supplied material for Neil Young's boat and Steve Miller's boat and others of that type.
Just how much are these woods worth? Take African Paduke, for example. Ordinarily pricey, it can be exorbitant, especially when unique patterns appear in a log.
The log had a very special figure to it, which made it worth slicing into veneers. It had a bird's eye effect, very small, little eye-looking figures all packed in next to each other, just covering the whole thing. That log sliced into veneer, sold for in excess of $100,000. It was an amazing thing.
Eden Saw began its business by supplying the yachting industry, and that sector is still of primary importance, accounting for 40% of the firm's business. As with Paduke, many of the veneers used in yachts come from Africa.
This particular exotic veneer is anagray. It's a Central African species of wood. This particular log is very figured, very curly. And if you look closely, you can see that it's about a 42nd of an inch thick, or 0.6 millimeter, which in inches is about 23 thousandths of an inch. This particular pile of material here is
in the neighborhood of about 11,000 square feet at the moment, and it's worth about 20,000 US dollars.
But it's not just veneers that are in demand. Sometimes solid pieces are called for.
This log is about 53 inches wide. Bubinga is also known as African rosewood. And what the craftspeople will do with this is they'll take it, they'll finish it down to a final rough piece of wood, and then they'll put whatever finish the owner wants on it. This will end up as probably a corporate conference table. And this piece of wood's worth about $2,000 as it sits. So it's quite nice material, and it's somewhat rare in the United States.
When woods are rare, dealers must walk a fine line. They can't be too rare, because then they could be classified as endangered. For many years, Brazilian rosewood was very popular, especially among guitar makers who used it for fretboards. But rosewood's popularity caused it to become endangered, and instrument makers stopped buying it from Brazil.
Brazilian rosewood is one of the favorite species from that territory that has been over-harvested for a long time. It's one of the woods we do not have, and I would not suppose that we could ever get any.
So for now, rosewood comes from other nations.
Some of the rosewoods and some of the ebonies and so on are still brought in from different parts of the world that still allow the export of it, and that the United States still allows the import from.
For the immediate future, exotic woods will continue to enter the U.S., and lumberyards carrying them will continue to flourish. Some exotic woods don't just come from distant places. They can come from distant times. Believe it or not, some are over 50,000 years old. There are lumberyards that deal with green wood, wood that has only recently been harvested from the forest. Others deal with recycled wood, wood that has been used previously. But there are some lumberyards that deal exclusively with wood that, like gold or diamonds, is literally mined. The Great Lakes hold a treasure trove of American and Canadian woods from a bygone era.
In the days of logging, the sawmills were typically located on rivers flowing into or out of the Great Lakes. So as the logging operations moved, they had a need to transport logs, generally in large rafts, across the Great Lakes.
But when accidents occurred, in storms, rough waters, or collisions, logs broke loose. Logs that became waterlogged sank. The cold water refrigerated the wood, preserving it for more than a century. These logs, called sinkers, not only survived, they also maintained their beauty.
They've come from, in some cases, very old growth forests, which grew slowly over time and have some very fine ring structures.
Some of the colors that happen because of its life underneath the waters are really subtly different than a modern harvested tree that has gone from the log to the mill to the kiln.
Sonar is used in the recovery process to find sinkers between 8 and 40 feet long. Once the divers attach cables to the logs, workers on vessels hoist them up. The species recovered from the Great Lakes include pine, birch, oak, and hemlock. Half a world away in New Zealand, there's an even rarer treasure than the logs of the Great Lakes. It's called kauri.
These trees fell over up to 50,000 years ago, were submersed in water, which eventually became a bog, which eventually became peat.
As the peat formed a shield against oxygen, no fungus could attack the wood, and it survived intact. Because European settlers clear-cut the kauri forests, only a small amount of living trees remain. Rare and now protected in preserves, some are up to 2,000 years old. At the beginning of the 20th century, The ancient fallen kauri were discovered by farmers when the surrounding ground settled and exposed the logs. Today, kauri is found the same way, more or less by accident. When the logs are located, bulldozers and backhoes are brought in to extract them. The kauri wood is not only rare, but remarkably beautiful. And yet, despite its 50,000-year age, kauri is easy to work with and is used to make fine furniture and cabinetry.
The characteristics of ancient kauri are not too different from a tree that you'll find today as far as the qualities of working with the wood itself.
However, that's where the similarities end.
The appearance of the wood is substantially different in that really, essentially, a phenomena has occurred inside the wood itself, which brings the grain of the wood to a shimmer, to a sheen that's not seen ordinarily in timbers today.
These unique characteristics are a result of tens of thousands of years of exposure to groundwater and minerals in the peat. Not surprisingly, kauri is expensive. It can range from $25 to $100 per board foot, depending on the particular qualities of the grain. The growing popularity of ancient kauri is yet another example of the encompassing nature of the modern lumberyard. Over time, new products and new innovations have kept this ancient industry evolving. And yet, fundamentally, the lumberyard itself remains unchanged.
One of the things about lumber is that it's bulky, it's a physical product. It's not something that can be UPS'd or Amazon.com'd very easily.
So we can count on the traditional services of the lumberyard to prevail for a long time to come.